In the 6th episode of Masters of the Air, Major John Bucky Egan is forced to parachute into Germany after his B-17 is badly damaged by German FW-190 fighters during the disastrous Munster raid on October 10, 1943. After initially evading capture, he is eventually taken prisoner and begins the journey to a Luftwaffe prisoner of war camp designated for captured Allied airmen. During the journey, the series depicts Egan and several fellow prisoners being marched through a German town devastated by recent Allied bombing. Enraged residents, driven by grief and anger over the destruction of their homes, attack the captured Americans. Egan survives by pretending to be dead, while the other prisoners are beaten and killed by the mob. Although this sequence is based on a real historical event known as the Rüsselsheim Massacre, Major John Egan himself was never involved. His presence was created by the show's writers to connect the historical incident with one of the series' principal characters. As with many scenes in historical dramas, the events were adapted and dramatized. However, the underlying story, much like that of Nurse Renée Lemaire, often remembered as the Angel of Bastogne, remains one that deserves to be remembered. While Egan did parachute into German territory after being shot down, there is little documented information about his actual journey to Stalag Luft 3, and it bore little resemblance to the events portrayed on screen. The most significant difference between the television adaptation and the historical event is the timing. The real massacre occurred nearly a year later, on the afternoon of August 24, 1944. An American B-24 Liberator known as Wham Bam Thank You Ma'am, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Norman J. Rogers, Jr., was severely damaged by German anti-aircraft fire while participating in a bombing mission against an airfield near Hanover. The aircraft could no longer remain airborne, forcing all 9 crew members to bail out near Hutterup. A member of the Volkssturm, serving as a lookout, quickly reported the parachuting airmen to local authorities. The nearby fire brigade and military personnel stationed at the local airfield were alerted, and search parties were immediately dispatched to locate the Americans. One crew member, Staff Sergeant Forrest W. Brennenstuhl, suffered severe abdominal injuries during the attack. After landing near a farm, he was discovered by an elderly farming couple who treated his wounds as best they could. Grateful for their assistance, Brennenstuhl presented them with his silk parachute. Within a few hours, most of the remaining crew had been captured by German troops and taken to the town hall in Graven for questioning. Following the interrogations, the majority of the prisoners, including Lieutenant Rogers, were transferred to a nearby military airfield where they spent the night under guard. Concerned about Brennenstuhl's worsening condition, Rogers insisted that he receive medical treatment. German soldiers transported the wounded airman to a hospital, where surgeons removed shrapnel from his body before transferring him to a military hospital in Munster for a second operation. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew were placed aboard a train bound for Stalag Luft at Oberrüssel, located north of Frankfurt. Throughout the journey, the Americans attracted hostile attention whenever the train stopped. German civilians gathered outside the rail cars, shouting insults, shaking their fists, and spitting through the windows at the captured airmen. On the night of August 25th, the Royal Air Force launched a major bombing raid against the Opel factory at Rüsselsheim. A force of 116 Avro Lancaster bombers dropped approximately 674 2,000-pound bombs, along with more than 400,000 incendiary devices. The raid caused extensive destruction, heavily damaging the factory as well as the surrounding railway network. It proved to be the largest bombing attack Rüsselsheim experienced during the Second World War. During the air raid, local air raid warden Josef Hartgen organized residents to extinguish fires and respond to the widespread destruction. The following morning, August 26th, the captured Americans continued their journey toward Oberrüssel. Because the railway had been badly damaged during the previous night's bombing, the prisoners were forced to leave the train and march through Rüsselsheim to reach another rail connection. Only 2 German soldiers escorted the group. As they passed through the battered streets, local residents assumed the American flyers had participated in the bombing that had devastated their town only hours earlier. Believing them to be responsible, an angry crowd quickly gathered around the prisoners. 2 women, Margrethe Witzler and Katha Reinhard, shouted accusations, calling them terror flyers and urging the crowd to tear them apart and kill them for destroying their homes. One of the American prisoners attempted to calm the situation by speaking in German, explaining that they had not bombed Rüsselsheim. His words had no effect. A woman hurled a brick toward the prisoners, triggering a violent assault. The growing mob attacked the defenseless airmen with rocks, sticks, hammers, and shovels. 3 Opel factory workers soon joined in, using iron bars to beat the prisoners as the surrounding crowd encouraged the violence. Josef Hartgen eventually entered the attack carrying a pistol. Throughout the assault, the 2 German guards failed to intervene or make any effort to protect the prisoners. Once the Americans had been beaten into unconsciousness, Hartgen lined 6 of them along the curb and executed them with shots to the head before exhausting his ammunition. 2 crew members, William M. Adams and Sidney E. Brown, remained alive despite their severe injuries. The attackers loaded both the dead and the wounded onto a cart and transported them toward a cemetery. Anyone showing signs of life was beaten again. When an air raid siren suddenly sounded, the mob scattered to seek shelter. Adams and Brown seized the opportunity to crawl away from the cart and escape toward the Rhine River. They successfully evaded capture for 4 days before eventually being discovered by a German policeman. They were then returned to custody and sent to Oberrussel, where they remained prisoners until the end of the war. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, American occupation forces entered Rüsselsheim. Investigators soon learned of the killings, and on June 28, 1945, the bodies of the murdered airmen were recovered. 11 local residents, including Josef Hartgen, were arrested and brought before a military commission in Darmstadt later that summer. During the trial, defense attorneys argued that the defendants had been influenced by years of Nazi propaganda, particularly speeches and publications by Joseph Goebbels encouraging German civilians to retaliate against downed Allied airmen. Prosecutor Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski rejected this argument, insisting that every defendant bore personal responsibility for participating in the murders. He argued that they were adults who knowingly chose to commit acts of violence and therefore could not escape responsibility by blaming propaganda alone. The murders represented clear violations of international law. Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war stated that prisoners were in the custody of the hostile government rather than the individuals who captured them. The convention further required that prisoners always be treated humanely and protected against violence, insults, and acts of public revenge. It specifically prohibited reprisals against prisoners of war. Similarly, Article 23 of the 1907 Hague Convention concerning the laws and customs of war on land prohibited the killing or wounding of enemies who had surrendered or were no longer capable of defending themselves. Germany had signed and ratified both agreements, making their provisions legally binding. The Commission also emphasized that civilians as well as soldiers were obligated to observe the laws of war. Nevertheless, history demonstrates that nearly every major participant in the Second World War committed violations of those laws at various points during the conflict. In many cases, however, legal accountability was imposed primarily upon the defeated nations after the war had ended. The military commission heard testimony over 6 days, including eyewitness accounts describing Hartgen's executions and the brutal beatings inflicted by members of the crowd. On August 2, 1945, Josef Hartgen, Johannes Seipel, Philipp Gottlieb, Friedrich Wust, Johannes Opper, Margrethe T. Witzler, and Katha Reinhard were found guilty and sentenced to death, while one defendant was acquitted. Heinrich Barthel and August Wolf each received sentences of 15 years of hard labor, and Georg Dahm was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. Following appeals submitted by Witzler's husband and Reinhard's brother-in-law, it was argued that the 2 women had only incited the violence verbally and had not physically attacked the prisoners. Their death sentences were subsequently commuted to 30 years of hard labor. On November 10, 1945, Hartgen and 4 other convicted men were executed by hanging at the prison in Bruchsal. Another participant, Otto Stolz, was later convicted and executed in 1947. A second German soldier, Franz Umstatter, was tried separately in 1946. Witnesses testified that he had stomped on the wounded prisoners with such force that his boots broke apart. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but the conviction was overturned in 1948 because of a technical error in the indictment, which failed to specify the location where the crimes had occurred. In later years, most of the surviving defendants were released. Margrethe Witzler and Katha Reinhard were paroled on December 19, 1953. Heinrich Barthel and August Wolf followed 2 days later, while Georg Dahm was released on February 5, 1954, dying approximately 1 year afterward. All eventually returned to their homes in Rüsselsheim. More than 80 years after the massacre, the crew of Wham Bam Thank You Ma'am continues to be remembered. The 6 men murdered at Rüsselsheim were among 1,015 Allied airmen who lost their lives at the hands of civilians during the Second World War, a tragic reminder that the violence of war often extended far beyond the battlefield itself.